My husband humiliated me at our anniversary dinner, laughing that I was terrible in bed, until someone at the table said, "That's not true. She's amazing." The silence that followed was a physical weight. Carter's glass froze halfway to his mouth, his smug grin curdling like sour milk. 5 couples stared at their plates as the candlelight flickered against the crystal. Shane Mercer sat across from us, his expression unreadable and calm. He didn't blink. He just let the truth hang there like a sharpened blade. The smell of seared rosemary and expensive wine suddenly felt like stage makeup. It was thick, suffocating, and entirely fake. I watched Carter's knuckles turn white around the stem of his glass. He had spent 4 years treating me like a useful piece of furniture. To him, I was a reliable roommate who paid half the bills and never complained. He thought he owned the room, but Shane had just flipped the script. Carter's eyes darted toward me, searching for a denial I wouldn't give. I took a slow sip of soda, keeping my gaze steady. 3 weeks ago, I had found his phone on the kitchen counter. I saw the messages from Lena. I read every word he wrote about my obedience and his plan to leave once my promotion finalized. He wanted a bigger settlement, a final payout for his years of pretended affection. He didn't realize I had already spent 20 days mourning us. I was no longer his wife. I was a ghost haunting his dinner party. "Excuse me." Carter's voice was a jagged edge. He looked at Shane, then back at me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. Shane shrugged and leaned back, his posture loose and indifferent. The other guests shifted in their seats. The sound of silk against wood loud in the vacuum. Monica's mouth was open, her fork suspended in mid-air. The mask Carter wore for the world was cracking. He needed me to lie for him. He needed me to be the victim again. I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the tension. I told the table I had seen the messages from Lena. I mentioned the hotel receipts and the way he mocked my career. The room went cold as I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal folder. I hadn't just watched him cheat. I had meticulously dismantled his future. I told him I turned down the promotion yesterday. The payout he was waiting for didn't exist anymore. He was officially served. The guests, including a silent and stone-faced Shane, scrambled to leave, mumbling apologies and avoiding eye contact. Within minutes, the dining room was a graveyard of half-eaten steak and abandoned wine. Carter stood trembling, his dignity stripped away in front of the people he most wanted to impress. Maya, his ex, appeared in the doorway, her smile sharp and satisfied. She had helped me gather the final pieces of evidence. Carter looked between us, realizing he was trapped. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back into the light. Carter's hand dropped as if my skin were hot iron. He looked at Maya, then at the heavy folder on the table. The silence in the room felt brittle, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. His confidence had vanished. Maya leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed and a sharp glint in her eyes. She was enjoying this far too much for my comfort. "You really think you can just throw me out?" Carter finally whispered. His voice was trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up a silver dessert spoon and watched my distorted reflection in the bowl. I felt a strange sense of detachment. The man I had loved for years was gone. In his place was a stranger with a bloodless face and frantic eyes. He was a small, broken man. I told him the lease was in my name alone. I had signed the paperwork for this new apartment while he was busy texting Lena about his future wealth. He looked around the room as if searching for a weapon or a way out. There was nowhere to go. I had changed every password and moved every cent of my personal savings. His plan to extract a settlement from my promotion was dead. I had effectively erased his entire financial map. Maya stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and set it next to the divorce papers. She told him that his boss had already seen the hotel receipts. Carter's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. The workplace affair was a fireable offense, and Lena was likely facing the same fate. He was losing his wife, his home, and his career in a single hour. "Why would you do this?" he asked, looking at Maya with pure hatred. She didn't flinch. She reminded him of the way he had discarded her years ago. He had used the same tactics and the same lies back then. I realized Maya wasn't here for me. She was here for herself. This wasn't a sisterhood, it was a cold, calculated strike. I was just the hand that held the blade. The realization made my stomach churn with sudden, sharp regret. The air in the hallway grew heavy with a new, dangerous pressure. Carter lunged toward the table, grabbing the USB drive as if he could destroy the truth by crushing the plastic. Maya moved to stop him, and for a moment, they were a tangle of limbs and frantic breathing. A chair tipped over with a loud, hollow crash. I stood my ground, watching them fight over the ruins. It was pathetic. They were two scavengers picking at the bones of my life. I stepped back and picked up my phone to call the police. The threat was enough to freeze them both in place. Carter had a thin line of blood on his lip from where Maya's hand had connected. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He realized I wasn't the obedient roommate anymore. I was the person holding the door open. He had exactly 5 minutes to leave before the sirens arrived, and I made it clear I wouldn't hesitate to give the police his location. The 5 minutes passed like a slow bleed. Carter scrambled to grab his leather briefcase, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He avoided my eyes as he stuffed a handful of loose papers and a stray phone charger into the bag. Maya remained by the window, her silhouette sharp against the city lights. She looked like a victor, but I saw the tremor in her hands. The room still smelled of rosemary, a mocking reminder of the dinner he had ruined. I stood by the kitchen island, my fingers tracing the cold granite edge. My objective was simple: get them both out before the sirens arrived. Carter stopped at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He looked back at me, his lips still swollen and leaking a bead of dark blood. He wanted to say something, a final plea or a bitter curse. I simply raised my phone and showed him the glowing screen. The timer was almost at 0. He finally stepped into the hallway, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Maya followed him, but she paused just before crossing the threshold. She looked at me with a strange, predatory expectation. She waited for a thank you or a sign that we were now allies. I remained a statue. I had used her anger to fuel my escape, but I had no intention of keeping her in my life. She was part of the sickness I was curing. The hallway light hummed with a low, electric buzz. Carter turned on Maya the moment the door began to swing shut. He accused her of orchestrating his downfall out of pure jealousy. Her laugh was a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the white walls. She didn't deny it. She leaned in close to his face, her voice a hiss of pure venom. I watched through the narrow gap as the two of them devolved into a new, private war. Suddenly, Maya's expression shifted from triumph to cold realization. She pulled her own phone out and began scrolling frantically. She told Carter that Lena had just posted a series of messages online. The affair wasn't just a corporate secret anymore, it was public. Lena was blaming Carter for everything, claiming he had manipulated her. The power balance shifted instantly. Carter wasn't just unemployed and homeless. He was becoming a pariah. Maya realized her revenge had grown far beyond her own control. I pushed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt with a heavy, final click. The sound of their muffled shouting continued for a few seconds before fading into the distance. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and took my first real breath in weeks. The silence of the apartment felt like a shield. I walked back to the table and looked at the abandoned silver spoon. My reflection was still distorted, but the image felt much clearer than before. A soft chime came from my laptop on the counter. I opened it to find an urgent email from my boss. He wasn't asking about the promotion I had declined. He was asking if I knew anything about the embezzlement charges currently being filed against the accounting department. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the attached document. Carter's name was listed at the very top of the investigation. The divorce was only the beginning of a much larger, darker storm. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred into gray static. My objective was simple: distance myself from the coming legal explosion. But the embezzlement charge was a new, jagged beast. Carter had not just been unfaithful. He had been reckless with company funds. If the money was missing from accounts we once shared, the investigators would look at me next. I felt the walls of the apartment closing in. My clean break was suddenly covered in his filth. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the door, needing air. As I stepped into the hallway, the smell of damp concrete replaced the rosemary. Maya was still there, leaning against the far wall with a look of frantic intensity. Carter had vanished into the night, likely fleeing to whatever hole he had dug for himself. She stepped into my path, her eyes scanning my face for a reaction. She wanted to know if I had seen the news about the corporate audit. "They think you helped him," Maya whispered, her voice trembling with a strange excitement. She showed me her phone screen, displaying a leaked internal memo. My name was mentioned alongside Carter's in a list of persons of interest regarding the unauthorized transfers. The power balance shifted again. I wasn't the victor anymore, I was a suspect. Maya wasn't just a bitter ex-girlfriend. She had been the one to tip off the auditors about my recent banking. I felt a cold prickle of sweat down my spine. I had moved my savings to protect myself, but the timing looked like a getaway. I looked at Maya and saw the truth behind her helpful mask. She didn't want justice for what Carter did to us. She wanted to see me burn as brightly as him. It was a secondary revenge she had kept hidden until now. My hands were shaking as I realized how deeply she had played me. I pushed past her and headed for the stairwell, avoiding the elevator. I needed to reach my lawyer before the police reached me. Every shadow in the parking garage felt like a trap waiting to spring. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a series of restricted calls. I ignored them, focused only on the cold metal of my car keys. I climbed inside the vehicle and locked the doors, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The engine roared to life, but the headlights revealed a figure standing at the exit. It was Lena, looking disheveled and desperate in the harsh fluorescent light. She wasn't the polished coworker from the photos anymore. She was holding a thick manila envelope against her chest like a shield. She stepped toward my window and mouthed a single word: "Wet." I shifted into gear, torn between the need to fly and the need to know the truth. I rolled the window down just an inch. Lena leaned in, her eyes wide with a terror that looked genuine. She told me Carter had framed her for the missing money months ago. She handed me the envelope, claiming it contained the actual login logs from his home computer. If she was telling the truth, I had the evidence to clear us both. But as I took the paper, I noticed a small, blinking GPS tracker tucked inside. I dropped the tracker onto the passenger seat like it was a live coal. My objective was to vanish into the city night, but Lena's wide, terrified eyes kept me anchored. The garage felt like a tomb of cold concrete and humming fluorescent tubes. Lena tapped on the glass again, her breath fogging the window. She looked fragile and broken, a far cry from the woman who had stolen my husband's attention. I finally unlocked the doors and let her inside. The interior of the car felt too small for the weight of our shared history. Lena sat huddled against the door, clutching her purse. She explained that Carter had been using her credentials to bypass the company's internal controls. He was the architect, and we were just the scaffolding. I looked at the manila envelope, feeling the thick stack of papers inside. If this was true, the digital trail led straight back to Carter's private server. He had played us both. I shifted the car into drive and peeled away from the curb. The tires screeched against the smooth floor, echoing through the empty garage. As we reached the exit, a black sedan pulled across the ramp, blocking our path. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I recognized the car instantly. It belonged to the private investigator Carter had mentioned months ago. The pressure was no longer just legal, it was becoming physical. We were trapped. Lena let out a small, choked sob and covered her face with her hands. I didn't have time for her breakdown. I reversed the car, the backup camera showing the dark corners of the garage. I needed a new way out. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a screenshot of my own bank account showing a fresh, massive transfer of stolen funds. Carter was framing me in real time. The power balance was swinging wildly toward my destruction. I realized then that Maya wasn't working alone. She had been feeding Carter information while pretending to help me. They were two predators who had decided to share a kill. My stomach churned at the depth of the deception. Lena looked at the screen and whispered that she knew where the server was hidden. It wasn't at the office. It was in the storage unit we had rented for our wedding decorations. That was where the real evidence lived. We needed to get there before the black sedan moved. I drove toward the pedestrian exit, clipping a concrete pillar in my haste. The sound of metal grinding against stone was sickening, but the car stayed true. I didn't stop. I told Lena to hold on tight as I aimed the car for the narrow gap between the sedan and the wall. We made it through with an inch to spare. The sedan didn't follow immediately. It waited, its headlights watching us like the eyes of a wolf. We reached the storage facility just as the rain began to fall. The corrugated metal doors looked like a row of silver teeth in the dark. I used my key to slide the heavy lock open. The unit was packed with boxes of old photos and silk flowers. I began digging through the memories of a life that had never truly existed. Beneath a stack of white linens, I found the glowing blue lights of a portable server. It was humming. The server sat on a milk crate, a silent witness to years of quiet theft. Blue lights pulsed in the dark, casting long, rhythmic shadows over the wedding decor. I reached for the power cable, but Lena grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She whispered that unplugging it might trigger a remote wipe. We needed to pull the data before Carter realized we were here. My objective was clear: secure the files and save myself. The air in the unit tasted of dust and old plastic. I fumbled with my laptop, connecting the interface cable with shaking hands. The transfer bar appeared, moving at an agonizing crawl. Outside, the rain hammered against the corrugated roof, a relentless and metallic roar. Lena stood guard at the entrance, her eyes darting between the rows of storage units. She looked like a ghost in the dim light. I could see the progress bar reaching 10%. Every second felt like an hour. We were vulnerable, exposed in this metal box, waiting for the shadows to move. Suddenly, the blue lights on the server turned a deep, angry red. A notification popped up on my screen, warning of an administrative override. Someone was accessing the system from a remote location. I realized Carter was already trying to delete the evidence. The power balance shifted again. I wasn't just downloading data. I was in a digital race against the man who had ruined my life. I bypassed the security prompts, pouring every ounce of my focus into the keyboard. I had to be faster. Someone is here. Lena hissed, stepping back into the shadows of the unit. I didn't look up from the screen. The transfer hit 40%. I heard the crunch of gravel outside, followed by the heavy thud of a car door closing. The black sedan had found us. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline. I told Lena to stay low and keep quiet. The sound of footsteps approached. Slow and deliberate. It wasn't the police. It was the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who was angry. The footsteps stopped right outside our unit. A shadow fell across the threshold, blocking the faint light from the street lamp. I held my breath, my fingers hovering over the keys. The transfer reached 60%. I could hear the wet rasp of someone breathing. It was Carter. He didn't yell or demand entry. He just stood there, letting the silence do the work. He knew we were trapped. He knew he had the advantage. I looked at the red lights on the server and felt sick. I know you're in there, Ariana, he said, his voice eerily calm. He sounded like the man I had first met, polished and persuasive. He told me that he could fix the legal mess if I just handed over the drive. He promised to take the blame for the embezzlement. It was a lie. A beautiful and practiced deception. I ignored him, watching the transfer bar hit 80%. Lena was trembling so hard the wedding boxes rattled. I reached out and squeezed her hand. We stayed silent. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed through the unit. Carter had struck the door with something heavy. He was losing his patience. The transfer reached 90%. I could see the names of the shell companies flashing on the screen. He hadn't just stolen from his firm, he had been laundering money for a third party. The scope of his crimes was staggering. I realized then that Carter wasn't just a cheat. He was a small cog in a very dangerous machine. I felt a new terror. The transfer finished with a soft chime. I ripped the cable out and stuffed the laptop into my bag. At that exact moment, the storage door was wrenched upward. The wet night air rushed in, smelling of asphalt and ozone. Carter stood there, a tire iron gripped in his right hand. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at the server, then at me. Behind him, the black sedan was idling, its headlights blinding us. He stepped toward me, raising the heavy iron bar. "Give it to me," he growled. I didn't move. I told him the data was already in the cloud, sent to my lawyer and the authorities. It was a bluff, but it worked. He hesitated, the tire iron lowering just an inch. Lena seized the moment and bolted past him, disappearing into the rain. Carter didn't chase her, but I hoped she had a place to hide. He was focused entirely on me. He realized I was the only one who could truly destroy him. He lunged forward. But a sudden flash of blue light stopped him cold. The police hadn't arrived, but Maya had. She stood behind him, holding the high-voltage taser she had pulled from her purse against his lower back. Carter collapsed instantly, his body twitching as he hit the wet gravel. Maya looked at me, her face smeared with rain and a dark, triumphant joy. She told me she had planted a tracker on his car and had been monitoring his phone since he left the hallway. She reached for my bag. Her eyes locked on the laptop. She wasn't here to save me. She wanted the evidence for her own blackmail scheme. I gripped the laptop bag tighter, my knuckles aching. My objective was simple: leave this gravel lot with the data intact. Maya stood over Carter's twitching body, the taser still humming in her hand. She looked at me with a hunger that had nothing to do with justice. She demanded the laptop, claiming she had earned the right to own Carter's ruin. I stepped back into the shadows of the storage unit. Rain lashed against my neck, cold and sharp. Maya wasn't my savior. She was a new predator. The black sedan's engine roared, its headlights cutting through the downpour like twin blades. A man stepped out from the driver's side, but he wasn't the private investigator I expected. He wore a high-end suit that looked out of place in the mud. He looked at the server, then at the taste man on the ground. The pressure in the lot shifted from personal to professional. This was the third party Carter had been laundering for. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for the hardware. Maya's bravado vanished instantly. She lowered the taser, her gaze fixed on the silenced pistol the stranger held. The power balance didn't just tip, it shattered. I realized then that my little drama of infidelity and divorce was a drop in a very deep ocean. The man told us to leave the laptop on the gravel and walk away. He spoke with the terrifying calm of someone who did this often. I looked at the red lights on the server. My life was worth less than a drive. I looked at Carter, who was beginning to groan and roll onto his side. He saw the man in the suit and his eyes went wide with a fresh, primal fear. He knew exactly who this was. He scrambled backward, his fingers digging into the wet gravel. He begged the man for more time, promising that the data was secure. It was a pathetic sight. My husband had sold our lives to a ghost. I felt a sudden, icy surge of clarity. I had to act now or die. I told the stranger that the server was rigged with a dead man switch. It was a lie I had practiced in my head during the download. I claimed that if the laptop moved more than 50 feet from the storage unit, the cloud would publish everything to the federal authorities. The man paused, his eyes narrowing as he evaluated my face. I held his gaze, my expression a mask of cold iron. Maya looked at me, her mouth hanging open. She finally realized I was playing a much bigger game. The stranger gestured for me to prove it. I opened the laptop, the screen illuminating the rain between us. I showed him the progress bar. I had actually finished minutes ago, but I labeled the destination folder as a public government server. The lie felt solid in my hands. He lowered the weapon slightly, calculating the risk. If he killed me, he lost control of the narrative. Carter tried to speak, but the man silenced him with a sharp, heavy kick to the ribs. The violence was sudden and efficient. "Send me the decryption key," the man ordered. I told him I would only do it once I was 10 miles away and safe. He looked at the idling sedan, then back at me. He was weighing the value of the stolen millions against the cost of a federal investigation. Silence stretched across the lot, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the rain. He finally nodded, a short and sharp movement. He stepped aside, allowing a narrow path toward my car. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I grabbed Maya by the arm and pulled her toward the driver's side. She was dead weight, paralyzed by the sight of the gun. I shoved her into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a desperate whine before catching. I shifted into reverse, my eyes glued to the man in the suit. He stood perfectly still watching us leave. He was a statue in the dark. We cleared the storage gates and hit the main road, the tires screaming on the wet asphalt. I drove without a destination, turning randomly to shake any possible tail. Maya finally spoke, her voice a thin and broken reed. She asked if the dead man's switch was real. I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes on the road. My objective was met, but the cost was visible in the rearview mirror. I was a fugitive now, tied to a secret that could swallow me whole. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Lena, sent from a burner number. She told me she had seen the man in the suit before at Carter's office. She claimed he was a high-ranking official in the city's tax department. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The embezzlement wasn't just corporate greed, it was a systemic rot. The embezzlement wasn't just corporate greed, it was a systemic rot. I looked at the laptop bag on the floorboard. I hadn't just secured my freedom. I had